If rent-to-rent contracts are so straightforward, then why is it that so many people get this completely wrong? There are 4 types of contracts that I've seen being used, and 2 of those are the right way to do it. Unfortunately, there are even trainers getting this completely wrong. In this video, I want to break down all 4 contracts and show you which is the right way to do it. If you're watching for the first time, my name is Hussain, and on this channel I use my 15 years of property investing experience to ultimately help you get further faster in your property investing journey. So what is rent to rent? Rent to rent is the concept of taking on a property from somebody else that you don't own for a contractual period, might be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, however long it is, and for you to then rent that property out again to somebody else in the process to make more money in the difference between the two. So for example, you're renting a property for £1,000 from a landlord, you're re-letting it back out for £2,000 and making £1,000 in the middle. Well, that's the Holy Grail. So why are people getting this completely wrong when it comes to the contracts? When we're getting started in this strategy, I think it's really important to ensure that we avoid mistakes. I remember when I did a skydive jump in Dubai a few years ago, it was an absolutely frightening experience as you fall out the plane, but an amazing experience on the way down. And it maybe only lasted a few minutes, but they spent about an hour teaching us how not to get hurt when we jump out of the plane and when we land. So they spent so much time to avoid us getting hurt, and this can be the same thing when we do these type of contracts and these types of deals. We want to make sure we're building a business for the long term and not something we're going to fall over flat on our face because we've got the paperwork completely wrong and we end up getting hurt. Whether you're doing rent to HMO or rent to service accommodation, there'll be 2 types of contracts that you need to set up. One will be with the owner of the property, and then there'll be another contract that you'll have with the people that occupy that particular property, your tenants or your guests. So let's first talk about the contract you have between the owner of the property. As I mentioned earlier, there's 4 types of contracts. 2 of these are completely wrong. Let's talk about one of the ones which is not the right way to do it. And that's using an AST agreement, which is a short-hold tenancy agreement, which is a standard agreement that a tenant has when they occupy a property. However, this is not the right contract you would use when you're taking on a property from somebody else. And the reason being, because it's not going to be your home. You are not going to be living in it, so it's the wrong type of contract. And the reason that you get some people using these is A, they really don't understand what they're doing. But secondly, you also get, when you're working with some agents, the agents may not necessarily understand which is the right way to set this up, and they just want to push their contract, and that's the one that they're putting forward for you to use. However, you'll see these contracts and they have various clauses crossed out, but remember, this is not the right way to do it. When it comes to a contract, it could really be just a piece of paper with whatever you've agreed between you and the other party, and hey presto, that's a contract. However, you've got to remember, when contracts are used, ultimately it's about if something goes wrong, you can refer back to the contract and say, what is it that we agreed to do in this particular circumstance or in this situation? That's really what the contract is there for, is to protect you and to protect the other side as well. And if you've got a contract that's either not written really well, or it's not going to be enforceable, or it's not legally correct, then really there's no point in having it. It's not really going to help anybody at all. Another type of contract that you'll see sometimes being used is a company let, or also known as a corporate let. And this type of contract is used when a company takes on a property, it rents a property, but then provides that as accommodation for its staff. So it's essentially accommodation that might be included in some type of employment for the people that are there. And the reason it may not be the right, and it isn't the right contract for you to use as a rent to renter, because what you'll be doing, it may be a business that you've got and you're taking that property on a business. However, the people that are going to be living in the property are not going to be your staff. They're going to be either tenants or guests staying on short stays, or there might be normal tenancies that you're issuing, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So let's now talk about the correct way of setting up these agreements. And remember, what I'm sharing with you is not legal advice, because I'm not a solicitor. What I'm sharing with you is my 15 years of property investing knowledge and experience, and about 9 years of doing these type of deals. So one of the correct ways of setting these up is a management agreement. And the way a management agreement works is you take on the property from the owner, and what you're able to do is then run and operate that property on their behalf. And that's the key thing. You're running the property for them as opposed to you getting complete control of the property. Now, this is very similar to how a letting agent operates, where they take on the control of that property, run it and operate it for the owner, and effectively pass the funds back on to the owner with a deduction of whatever they're taking. Now, I've seen some of these contracts being adjusted and, well, let's just say frankly, butchered to be able to fit a certain purpose, and people say, no, this is the right way to do it. But ultimately, it's important that they are set up and they're correct for the right purpose. Now, if you're setting up and running contracts in this way, you also need to think about how your income is considered as well. So what you are now collecting is no longer rent, but actually management fees. So then the thing to bear in mind is that you'll be falling into VAT probably much quicker than you would have been in business ordinarily, because when you collect rent doesn't attract VAT, but management fees does. So it's something really fundamental to be mindful of. Now, we're not talking about accounting and tax necessarily in this video, but it is something to be aware of. In fact, if you'd like to learn more about how the taxation works in this type of business, just put a comment in the comment section below, and if enough people ask, what I'll do is I'll arrange for a property tax consultant to come on and talk specifically about the taxation angles and how to get this up and set it up right. And of course, if you're enjoying this content, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, enable the notification bell as well so you're notified when we're releasing these videos, because remember, I have 3 videos a week specifically for you. So let's now talk about another one of the correct ways to set up these type of contracts, and that's by setting up a lease, or a commercial lease sometimes as known as FRI, which is a full repairing and insuring lease. Now, these are typically the type of leases you would have if you were leasing, say, a shop, a warehouse, or a commercial building of some sort. They're commercial leases but used on a residential property. Now, this is my favorite way of setting up these types of deals. I think it's a solid and a strong contract, and this has been my preferred method. Not all of my rent-to-rents have been set up in this way. Some have been management agreements, but most of them have been based on leases, and I think it's a much more better way to set and structure the deal. And also, the money that you're collecting each month is rent, because what happens is you take on the property from the landlord, and effectively you now become the landlord to be able to then rent it out as tenants, ASTs, or whether it's a short stay service accommodation. And because if you're collecting rent, you now are the landlord, there's no VAT on that. Of course, there'll be other taxation to think about, but from that point of view, it's fairly tax efficient in terms of the way that's particularly set up. Now, one other thing to think about, which is really important, and again, many people get this wrong, it's not just this in its isolation you need to think about. You think about what else is it going to impact and how is this going to work. So for instance, if there is a mortgage on the property, which sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't, it just depends on who you're speaking to in terms of the owner of the property. If there is a mortgage on the property, it's very, very likely that they will not give you consent to set up a lease. So how's that going to work then? Well, occasionally you'll find some commercial mortgages may allow you to do that, but generally speaking, it's safe to assume you're not going to be able to put a lease on a property which has a mortgage on it. And I know some people do, but again, what I'm doing is giving you the pointers on how to do it correctly, not necessarily what everybody does, because there are many people that get this completely wrong. So in that case, you use a management agreement, because that's, as I said, it's very similar to how a letting agency operates, and your lender will have no issues with that. If you are going to the management contract route even, then you need to be mindful that as operating as a letting agent, you need to have all the compliance in place that you need to be able to run a letting agency. If you're interested in learning about how to set up a letting agency, again, put a comment in the comment section below. If enough people ask, I'm happy to do a video specifically around that, because I've set up 2 now over the recent years. In a moment, we'll talk about the different types of contracts you need to set up with the people occupying the property. But just before we do that, remember, when you're setting up an agreement with the owner of the property, whether it's with an agent or whether it's direct, it's really important you're using a management agreement or a lease. And anything other than that is probably not going to be the best way to do it and the best way to set it up. A few other things to bear in mind when you're doing this is how long is the contract going to be for? It says it might be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years even. And when you get to a certain length of leases, they need to be registered, so that's something to be mindful of. A good solicitor setting this up should be able to advise you on how to do this correctly. If you're spending money on the property at the beginning, getting it ready, renovating it, or whether it's just getting it clean and tidy, you'll have a spend of some money that's going onto that property. That might be a few £100, it could be running into thousands of pounds. So my preference has been, for me, when I'm doing these agreements, to have much longer periods of contracts, like 5, 6, 7 year type arrangements. And then during that time, I'll spend quite a bit of money up front on the property to get it the way I want, to be able to maximize that rent. And it might take me up to a year to recover that initial investment on that property, but then I've got 5-6 years of very good profit coming from that property. Now, what I really don't want during that time is for the landlord to change their mind, decide they want to take the property back, and hey presto, I'm out of pocket. So when you're setting up these type of agreements, when you're thinking about the lengths, also think about break clauses. My preference is the break clauses on one side, i.e. our side, and not the other side. And the reason you can use for doing that is, look, you're going to be investing quite a bit of time and money into setting this up for them. What you can't afford for them to do is to be able to change your mind and just pull this away from you. And the reason we need a break agreement is if for some reason the market changed, condition changed, licensing changed, something happened that meant that it was no longer viable, what we were initially intending to do with that property, we need to be able to exit out of it and not fall into a financial trap with the owner. So it's making it fair from that point of view and allowing people to understand. So look, I hope you find this useful. If you've got any other questions, put them in the comment section below. Remember, on a Monday, I do a live Q&A. That's the best place to get your questions answered. Let's now talk about the contracts that you would have set up with the tenants. When it comes to the people occupying the property, there's two types of agreements that you can use. The most common one is a standard AST agreement or a short-hold tenancy agreement. And essentially what that is, it's the agreement that somebody has when they're renting a property and it becomes their home. That could be a room, it could be a flat, it could be a house. It doesn't really matter. If it's their home, that's the contract they're using. And all the rules and regulations around those is what applies. Now, even if somebody moves into your property and you decide not to give them a written agreement, default in law, it'll end up as a AST. It's just verbal. Now, that's not a good position to be in because you haven't got the terms and conditions around that. So the AST is what we would have. So for example, if you're doing a rent to HMO, the people that are taking on those rooms with you, what they'll be your tenants on an AST. The other type of occupant you might have in a property, somebody's staying there for a short period of time. Let's say they're staying there for 2 weeks or a month. It's unlikely that that's going to be their main home. So they may be traveling, they might be there for work purposes, and essentially they have a home elsewhere. So during that process, what you're doing is using what's called a license to occupy. For instance, if you go and stay at a hotel for a couple of nights, you sign an agreement with them, their terms and conditions, whether you read them or not, essentially what you're doing is signing up to a license to occupy. Now, if you don't pay your payment, the following day they can just come and throw you out, or security will eject you from the property. Whereas if somebody's on an AST agreement, you've got to go through the process of serving their notices. And this actually is a really good point in time for me to mention the contracts need to be set up correctly the way I've been talking about now, because if you end up in court trying to evict somebody and it turns out you've got the wrong agreements, I've had people literally crying on the phone to me, ringing me up from court, say the judge has just thrown this out because I did XYZ, and I asked them a series of questions and it just turns out that they've got the wrong contracts and now they're stuck, they're in quite a mess and they'll be losing money while they try and get that problem resolved. So it's important they're using the right type of contracts. Let me know if you're finding this content useful. I hope you've enjoyed the video and I look forward to seeing you again on the next one.